Hello, everybody. I'm Jacob Sadavoy,
And I'm Michelle Zuby.
and here we are with Kristine Rodriguez, who is gracious enough to take some time out of her busy schedule to talk to us a little bit about acceptance and commitment training. How are you, Kristine?
Doing well. How you doing?
Very well, thank you. So we'd love to learn about a little bit more about acceptance and commitment training and therapy, and potentially broader applications.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think when we were writing this particular piece, we were looking to focus on one of the tools that we can use as part of our toolkit of acceptance and commitment training, and that's the ACT matrix. And so sort of digging into how we use that, it becomes a self-management tool for us where we can visualize how we can really contact reinforcement, positive reinforcement particularly. So imagine, if you will, I really should have brought, my daughter's whiteboard from school. So a graphic is helpful. So we include some examples in the essay, but basically there's a line across the middle. Below that line is going to be our private events. So our thoughts and feelings. Sometimes thoughts and feelings help us make great choices in our actions, and sometimes they get in our way. And then above the line is going to be our overt behaviors. So this is an example of a tool where we can incorporate private events and overt behaviors using some of these tools. And then in that graphic, there's also a line right down the middle that goes top to bottom that separates on the left-hand side difficult thoughts and feelings and avoidant behaviors that tend to go with them. And then our values on the right side. And on the right-hand side, as overt behavior, we can look at the types of behaviors we want to engage in that are a step toward our values. So we really use this tool to notice difficult thoughts and feelings. And then in noticing that, it allows us the space to choose actions that are either away from our values or toward our values. And so it's a great tool for digging into that work.
So I have a question. And again, we spoke briefly before we started this, but I'm a huge fan of ACT and a huge fan of the Matrix. How would you suggest using this tool, using the Matrix, for practitioners to sort of self-reflect, right? You said it's a self-management tool, to be more compassionate in their practice.
Such a great question. And we could probably talk about different examples for hours. So that's why I love it so much. So, I try to use it every day to build fluency. And so I'll try to offer a few examples because I do think it's really valuable in helping us choose. When we talked about choosing those actions that are in line with our values, that's where if you truly hold compassion, and if we might define that as alleviating the suffering of others, if I truly hold compassion as a value, then I can use these tools in really difficult circumstances to choose, even when I'm feeling uncomfortable, to take actions that potentially could alleviate the suffering of others. And so examples that we might look at is when I'm working with, let's say, a caregiver. If you're working with developmental disabilities, you're working with clients in a home, you might have a caregiver who's really going through some difficulty and is upset with the way you're working, isn't happy with the program. You want to build more clinical alignment. When you are getting, we use the example of an angry voicemail, and we were taking some examples from the Taylor and LeBlanc article. So when you have an angry voicemail and you're trying to figure out what to do with it, right? When you believe you're doing a great program and you're doing your best and you're trying to help a child, and then you're hearing this, someone who's upset with you, it is natural to feel really difficult feelings. So you might feel defensive. You might feel like you're not good enough, or this is beyond your scope. You might feel annoyed. You might feel any of these human thoughts and feelings that come up, right? So you can choose to ignore it. You can choose to strong arm a program and say, I'm going to do it my way because I'm an expert. You can go at it that way and see how that goes for you. Or you can practice empathy, which we sort of task analyze as a perspective taking activity, right? So why might the parent be feeling this way? What are our shared values, and how can I have a productive conversation where there's mutual benefit, right? Those are all things that are difficult to choose from when you're feeling all these really difficult thoughts and feelings. So the matrix allows us just a moment to separate ourselves from our thoughts and feelings and say, I get to choose. how I respond to this voicemail, right? I can call and I can listen and I can be empathetic, and then I can engage in a compassionate response, which is where I try to meet families' needs and align my work with their values to serve their child, because they're the parent. They have a legitimate view on what their child needs and wants, and we want to be partners in that. Other examples on how we can use this every day can go really outside of our work in the home. We can use this tool to advocate as allies for any social justice issue that we're taking on. So when we are trying to have those one-on-one conversations with someone who is discriminating against someone based on their race, their gender, their abilities, one thing we know about human behavior is it's not enough to just call someone out for something and expect them to magically change, right? You can't, when you're pursuing social justice, you walk up to a friend or family member and say, I gotta tell you, you are a racist. That might be accurate. The likelihood that that is then going to shape their behavior in a meaningful way is, I think, probably slim, right? True or not, when folks get labeled as things, that may become an aversive event for them and they don't want to talk to you about it anymore. And so then I've just lost my ability to have potentially further conversations that could shape behavior. And what's being presented in some of the activist groups that I participate in is that I'm learning from is really about, there are no one and done conversations to shape behavior, right? So we really need to be persistent, and this is a tool that we can use. That I can have the first conversation and say, oh, I'm discouraged with how that went. Do I want to have another uncomfortable conversation with Uncle whoever, you know? And when I think about the matrix, I can think, well, the last time we tried to talk about it, I felt defeated, I felt ineffective, I felt like he wasn't hearing what I was trying to talk to him about, and I was coming from a good place. Do I want to try to have a conversation again? Well, if my value is equity and justice and trying to move that in the world, then I probably will have another conversation. I might do it differently. I might pick a different time or place or way of communicating it. But part of how I've seen the matrix used, I think, effectively in social justice work is understanding that anytime I choose the away behavior, anytime I choose that left-hand side of avoiding, that's actually a reflection of privilege for me, right? White privilege means I can just walk away from that and say, I tried, I'm done. I get to be done for the day, right? So that's uncomfortable. And so really using the matrix to think through that, I can say, I need to persist in my work in having conversations with friends and family, trying to be an ally to different oppressed communities. I need to continue in that work even when it feels uncomfortable or it's hard, because that I'm called to do that, right? So those are just a couple of a couple of ways that come up pretty frequently. And then I also think it's really useful for self-compassion. So we get, what's known in this field and all the helping professions is compassion fatigue, right? Where we care so much every day and we try to alleviate suffering every day. And who's caring for us, right? We're the ones who need to participate in caring for us. And so sometimes it means thinking about how I respond to things, whether it's a work thing or a personal thing. And I can use the matrix to say, is the way I'm approaching that, even in the way I think about my progress or the way I talk to myself, is that helpful? Is that being compassionate toward myself? So those are some of the examples that we sort of touch on in the essay. And these are ways that we can use it every day.
That was such a beautiful walkthrough of the matrix and such phenomenal examples. And one thing that it really struck a chord for me when you talked about advocating, and coming from that place of privilege where I can just avoid. And so much of that, Jacob and I, like when we were discussing doing the book, so much of that showed up, right? Because we felt so passionate about doing this project. We felt like this needed to be done. We had the idea, like, let's just, let's get this done. But then there was so much showing up for us, like, okay, well, we're two white people of privilege. How is that going to be viewed? How so many things, so many variables went into it. And we very easily could have just said, nope, let somebody else do it, not for us. And that just made me, like, when you said that, that just resonated so much. Like, it sent chills down my spine because I think for all of us moving forward, again, I'm a huge fan of ACT and the Matrix, like I said, but I think if we can ask ourselves those questions in the moment, pause, right? What am I avoiding? What do I want to move towards? And what are the actions that I need to take to commit to that? It's just so huge and it's so transformative. And I love this chapter, obviously, of course. But just
for me. Well, I'm sorry. It's piggybacking on that makes me think you can't fool the matrix about your values. And that's where in this moment of trying to sift through what's performative and what's effective, not only are you're modeling doing the work, which I so appreciate, and disseminating the work. And I think for us individually, that the ACT matrix only works if we're authentic in the value that we choose, because it's all about contacting that positive reinforcement. Well, it's only positive intrinsic reinforcement if I actually really care about that thing. And so I think that's where it becomes, for me, helpful in sorting through what's an action that might have me perceived in a moment as an ally versus what is an action that for me, I truly believe will move the needle in a way that's productive. Because one of the great things about, ABA, but ACT as an application of that, is you only keep what works. So if something isn't effective, it doesn't work and we try something else, right? So that's why I love it as a potential tool too for social justice work, because we're not always successful in the way that we try to move the needle on important issues. And so this just helps us kind of come back, center, reevaluate. Was my approach effective? Was it in line authentically with my values, or do I need to try this a different way?
What I really appreciate in this conversation is not the fact that you're advocating changing someone else's values, right? Like kind of this is all intrinsic. This is all about you and your overt behaviors and like kind of where you stand in the matrix. And I think that's important because I think a lot of the time success is seen by changing someone else's point of view, which is not accurate. And I'd love for you to like kind of talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, such a good observation. And I personally feel social media can really exacerbate that, where you have these very black and white, exchanges on whatever topic, politics, etc. Right? And it's not to say that there aren't things that are truly right and wrong in this world, but it is to say if you won the argument but you didn't change someone else's behavior, you didn't win anything. If you believe you're on the side of justice, right? And so I think one thing that is so helpful for me to highlight in any ACT work, but it includes in using the matrix, is to your point, it's not for me to decide someone else's values. It's also not for me I try to avoid placing judgments on how I moved toward or away from a given value in any given day. Because the fact is, when we hold different values, we have to balance them. And so I value being, effective and impactful in my work. I also value being a great mom. I'm not always feeling successful in the combination of those two things. And I think that's common for folks. It's hard for me to feel like I'm doing both 100% because I literally can't be everywhere at once. And so sometimes I'm going to make a decision to, I'm not going to meet said deadline on a project that's important to me because I'm choosing in that moment to play with my kids. And I'm going to apologize and take accountability for that. But I think what's important is, rather than judging that and saying to ourselves, this gets back to the self-compassion, rather than saying to myself, oh, I'm a bad employee. Well, that's not it. That's not the thing that it is. The thing that it is in moving away from this value, I actually moved toward a different one, which in that moment was being actively engaged with my children. And, for me, I feel like I tend to be hard on myself because I think I inverse that. I far too often choose the work thing because I care so much about my work, and it's so reinforcing to me. And I often am using this process to prompt myself to choose time with my kids, right? But I think to the point of trying to get alignment on things, that is where if the two people in a conversation hold different values, it is harder for either to feel like they got what they needed out of that exchange. And so sometimes I think some of these conversations would be aided by saying, what are we trying to achieve here? Like, what are we trying to do? Because if we don't value the same things, I don't think you'll get that far with behavior that's measurable.
But again, like just going back, if you go into that conversation with compassion and empathy and perspective taking, it's a difference between having a conversation where you both shrug your shoulders and leave, as opposed to being irate with one another. So I think that's very important.
I think we try to, in these conversations, we try to remind ourselves that everybody's usually doing the best they can with what they have, with the skills they have. And I think what I also think is important for trying to use the matrix to sort of effect change is keeping in mind, not everybody brings the same tools to the conversation when it comes to responding to their own thoughts and feelings. I've been practicing this for, I don't know, maybe 2 years, and that's still quite new to me. It's helped me a ton, but there are some folks who, their learning history with difficult thoughts and feelings, as an example, shame, right? So like reading what Brene Brown tells us about shame and how aversive that can be for people. If someone, if something I say in trying to have a productive conversation triggers really uncomfortable thoughts and emotions for someone else that they are not at all equipped to wade through, they're likely to just shut down the day and leave. So I think remembering that just because I have a spiffy tool that I use that I think is really productive for me, it doesn't mean someone is oriented to that way of processing things at all. And that's where I agree with you. I think coming in with empathy on my part, that someone else has a different way of processing information and that this works for me, it may or may not work for them. I shouldn't be forcing it upon them. I offer this in trainings that we do. I offer this as a tool that I find helpful. We try to help people find what's right for them, so that they can process thoughts and feelings that are difficult and make choices that feel good.
That's also, excuse me, that's also kind of the beauty of ACT too, right? Is the flexibility of it. And you did kind of touch on that. I just wanted to make it more salient for people to just understand that it doesn't have to look like, this matrix specifically or the hexaflex specifically. We can still work within that framework and just have it be really flexible and meet somebody where they are. And maybe eventually they'll come to the party with at least one of those tools or all of the tools. But that's kind of the beauty of it all. So I just wanted to, again, make that a little bit more available to people who may not know that.
Yeah, I love that, because the way that a tool like this can work with flexibility is we kind of believe that those thoughts and feelings we have dictate what comes out of our mouth or what we do with our body, right? Is I couldn't help but call you such and such name because I was mad. Well, that was a reaction that you had, but with practice, we can feel angry things, anxious things, really uncomfortable things, and then make a choice not to behave that way, right? And that's not at all to speak to, tone policing and absolutely, oppressed people's marginalized populations need to have the space to speak freely and honestly and authentically. And it's not a thing about tone policing, but when I think about personal relationships, right, with someone that I'm close to, we know that we can, hurt our spouse or our children. I don't want to yell at my kids, but they drive me crazy sometimes, and so it really is that separation that it creates gives us this flexibility to say, oh, I'm not beholden to what my brain says I must react in this way. I can actually choose with practice to respond compassionately to my child who's really, really on my last nerve, because my value is that I want them to remember me as a mom who had patience for them and made time for them and those things. So I love that it creates that, particularly that flexibility or freedom from what our brain is telling us in that moment. You have to react this way.
It's fantastic. Thank you so much. Like just a fantastic overview. And like Michelle, the chapter was fantastic. And I hope everybody reads it. Personally, what are you up to? Any recommendations for the audience? Anything that they should be aware of or that you recommend that has inspired you, that you really appreciate?
Oh, so many things jump to mind, but for me, I'm going to start with reading all the other chapters because the topics are really exciting, and these are folks in this table of contents that I really love to learn from. So just I appreciate the scope of what you've put together, and I'm really looking forward to the other the speaker interviews so that I can hear this. So I think that's what's going to be getting me excited over the next couple months, is waiting for these to come out. So I
Thank you.
appreciate what you're doing. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time. This was absolutely fantastic.
All right. Thank you both, and take care.